Okay, so I should say, I don't have a watch. My phone says it's 2:00, so we should start. Yay. So, welcome to the second installment of my talks about the 1960s. My topic for today is basically domestic politics during the 60s, and in particular, President Lyndon Johnson's vision of what he called the Great Society, and a flurry of reform legislation that the Democrats in Congress passed in the mid-60s. But in order to talk about Johnson's Great Society, I want to provide some context of kind of other reform movements in American history. And in order to do that, I want to go back to kind of the most basic question of why do we have a federal government and what do we want it to do? If you remember, the America originally was 13 colonies and then states. The states are the original layer of government in our country. And at some point, thanks to events in the 1780s, they held a convention and they drafted a constitution to create on top of the states some sort of national government. And the question is, what do you want that national government to do? Ordinary legislation, ordinary keeping the peace, that kind of stuff is left to the states, but we also have a federal government. What should it do? The people who designed that Constitution and set up the government at the beginning had very different ideas of what the national government should do. Thomas Jefferson really didn't want the national government to do a whole lot more than sell public land to settlers and deliver the mail. As he saw it, we were going to be a nation of farmers into the foreseeable future, and the government should just provide an environment in which people could farm and be prosperous and have land for their children. And yeah, if the government delivers the mail, that's a good thing, but it doesn't need to do much beyond that. Alexander Hamilton, on the right there, who became the first Secretary of the Treasury, had a much different idea in which the national government would help to promote economic growth and help the country industrialize, in a sense, become stronger economically. Now, for the first part of the 19th century, Jefferson and his followers, most notably President Andrew Jackson, they kind of dominated national politics, and the federal government didn't do a whole lot up until the Civil War. But in the long run, Hamilton won. And over the course of the 19th century and into the 20th, the national government has started doing more and more to encourage economic growth and in other ways to change the kind of society that we have. So this is fasten your seatbelts. This is a quick history of American reform leading up to the 1960s. What did the government do in the latter part of the 19th century? The national government, one thing it did very effectively was take land from the American Indians, often through the form of a treaty that the government then ignored. But the government took an awful lot of land from Indians and then sold it to settlers. And it made possible an amazing expansion of white settlement across the Mississippi and onto the Great Plains. The national government in the 19th century subsidized the railroad system. How did we get the railroad network that links the country together? The federal government was really generous in handing out land and loaning money on very favorable terms to the railroads. And one other thing the national government did was to help American industry, particularly industries like steel. It used high tariffs, and you all understand, and since they're in the news again today, tariffs raised the cost of imports. And at the time in the 19th century, Great Britain was the industrial power in the world. And Great Britain, for example, had the best industry, made the best steel, and made it cheaper. And in order for American steel manufacturers to compete, the national government imposed a tariff that made British steel really expensive. And it made possible the success of people like Andrew Carnegie building their own steel companies in America. What else happened in the late 19th century is some people started wanting the government to protect the less fortunate by using some form of regulation. And so I've flagged the two big developments at the end of the 19th century, something called the Interstate Commerce Act. In the after the Civil War, farm prices steadily went down in this country. American farmers were producing too much, prices were going down. Farmers complained that they were getting exploited by the railroads and demanded that Congress do something to help them. Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act and establishing the principle that railroad rates are supposed to be reasonable and fair. And it created the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was the first big regulatory agency. I mean, today we're just, there are so many federal regulatory agencies that, you can't possibly name them all. But this was the first one, the Interstate Commerce Commission. Also, at the end of the 19th century, businesses in America were getting bigger and bigger. Think of names like Standard Oil, which was ending up controlling about 90% of the oil refinery output in the United States. A lot of people were afraid that small businesses were going to get crushed by big business and that consumers would get overcharged. And so Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. As it turns out, at the end of the 19th century, the federal courts pretty much neutralized both of those regulations. They made them so that they hardly had any impact at all. And so at the start of the 20th century, it was still the case the federal government wasn't really doing a whole lot more than imposing a tariff in order to protect manufacturers. But at the start of the 20th century, we had the first of what had been a series of reform movements wanting the government to do more to make life better for more people. And at the beginning of the 20th century, we went through what was called the Progressive Era. America was industrializing really, really fast at the end of the 19th century. Cities were getting bigger, factories were getting bigger, millions of immigrants were coming over from Europe, living in very overcrowded conditions, working in very unsafe factories. There were a lot of strikes. There was a lot of clear poverty in the country. And progressivism was a kind of middle-class reform movement designed to fix some of the problems of industrial America. And the problems as they were perceived included problems with the political process. So, for example, the Progressive Era brought us 3 constitutional amendments. Up until the 16th Amendment, Congress did not have the power to levy an income tax because the Supreme Court had said that it couldn't. The 16th Amendment gives Congress the power to impose an income tax. Up until the 17th Amendment, it was the state legislatures that chose U.S. senators. We didn't vote for them. The legislatures picked them. That was considered undemocratic. The 17th Amendment made it so that we all get to vote for senators the way we do members of the House of Representatives. Up until 1920, only men could vote. The 19th Amendment provided votes for women. It went into effect for the 1920 presidential election. In further efforts to reform the business and the economy, Congress created the Federal Trade Commission to prevent unfair trade practices. And it created the Federal Reserve System, which we still have today and which is front page news because President Trump has all sorts of things he wants the Federal Reserve to do, and if they're not doing them, he intends to fire them. But the Federal Reserve was created to manage the money supply in a way that prior to that, there was no official currency really, and there was a certain amount of monetary chaos that the Federal Reserve solved. You had the beginnings of consumer protection. And people remember Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle? Some of you may have read that in high school, the one about meat packing out in Chicago and all the horrible things that end up in the sausages. That book was a bestseller, and Congress responded with a Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. One other aspect of the reforms in the Progressive Era was prohibition. There was a strong sense amongst many in the middle class that the working class, and particularly immigrants, were dangerous partly because they drank too much. And prohibition was an attempt to control behavior by people who were considered somewhat untrustworthy. Now, the progressive movement came and went. It went about 20 years worth. It ended with the end of World War I. During the 1920s, the Republican Party controlled national politics and went back to the idea that all the government really needs to do is levy a tariff to protect manufacturers. And then we got the Great Depression. And in the Great Depression, it seemed for a time like the whole capitalist system in this country was in jeopardy. And, this is not the place to go into the details, but the statistics about what happened during the Great Depression and how bad it was are really mind-numbing. The stock market was down 90% by 1932. Unemployment officially was 25%. In reality, it was, much higher than that in many places. Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1932, promising bold experimentation to fight the Depression, and he delivered. And so the second and in many ways the most important reform period in our history is the New Deal. So a quick run through of some of because the federal government was totally different after the New Deal. What sorts of things did Congress pass? And in a very short space of a few years, Congress revolutionized one area after another. The system in agriculture, price supports, crop limits, paying farmers not to produce in order to keep agricultural prices up. Congress created a vast system to fix the Tennessee Valley, which the Tennessee River flows through about 7 southern states. And it was, the river flooded. It was a very tough place to be a farmer. Congress created the Tennessee Valley Authority. They built dams, they generated electric power, and it revolutionized that whole region of the country. Up until the New Deal, most farmers were living by candlelight. A program in the New Deal brought electricity into the countryside. By the end of the 30s, 90% of farms actually had electric lights. One other thing, if you had electricity, you could also listen to the radio, which ended the isolation that a lot of American farmers had experienced. The federal government started supervising troubled banks. Up until the Great Depression, there was no protection if a bank failed and lost your money. Congress created the insurance system we have today, the FDIC, to insure bank deposits. Up until the New Deal, there was no regulation of the stock market. Congress passed the Securities and Exchange Act, created an agency to supervise the exchanges, to register stocks, to pursue fraud. Several other agencies to regulate various parts of the media, like the telephone and radios, the airlines. The New Deal created agencies to ensure federal housing, home repairs, an agency to provide insurance for mortgages, an agency to supervise collective bargaining, so that unions, up until the New Deal, unions had very little hope of a fair deal with their employers because the courts had made it very hard to organize. Congress changed the rules with the National Labor Relations Act. Congress imposed maximum hours and minimum wages. Congress adopted a progressive income tax to help pay for all of that stuff. And on a more fundamental level, Congress really made an effort to help the unemployed during the Depression and help other people in need. It put people to work out in the countryside, the Civilian Conservation Corps. It built major construction projects like the Hoover Dam and the Triborough Bridge in New York. The WPA, Works Progress Administration, spent $11 billion and employed 8 million people. 20% of all workers in the country got jobs through the WPA at one point during the 30s. And so, try that again. The New Deal created all sorts of new agencies. And I tried to list some of them there. Most of them are still here. Now, the revolution of the New Deal was only possible because it really did seem like the capitalist system in this country was on the verge of complete breakdown. But it wasn't just a practical response, though, to those problems. Uniting the New Deal was a vision of Franklin Roosevelt. And I want to quote from it a bit, because this is really, I think it makes sense out of Lyndon Johnson, but it also makes sense on a bigger level to try to explain some things. In his second inaugural address in 1937, this is what Franklin Roosevelt said. "Here is the challenge to our democracy. I see millions of families trying to live on..." Oh, hello. I can still see, but I'm not sure that was the plan. Cassie? You're working on it. Okay. "I see millions of families living in the dark because the lights have gone off." No. Not what I meant. "I see millions of families," this is Roosevelt, "millions of families trying to live on incomes so meager that the pall of family disaster hangs over them day by day. I see millions denied education, recreation, and the opportunity to better their lot and the lot of their children. I see 1/3 of the nation ill-housed, ill-clad, and ill-nourished. It is not in despair that I paint you that picture. I paint it for you in hope, because the nation, seeing and understanding the injustice of it, proposes to paint it out." And this is the key sentence. "The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little." That speech, that is the charter of liberalism in the 20th century. It's the notion that we're all in this together, and the system is inherently unfair. Some people have more than other people, not because they're better, but because of, not that they're better people, but for a variety of circumstances over which they have no control. And it is the job of the government to try to do something about that. And Roosevelt, it was in the context of the Great Depression that made a lot of sense, and Roosevelt got elected over and over because people liked what they heard. But it's not as if the problems and the need for that kind of government went away after the 1930s. So after World War II, Presidents Harry Truman. Truman wanted to continue the New Deal. He had a variety of things, including national health insurance, that he wanted to try to pass. At that point, Republicans had regained control of Congress. They said no. Then came former General Dwight Eisenhower, elected in 1952. He was an economic conservative. He very much officially believed in a balanced budget. On the other hand, he made no effort to undermine any of the major reforms of the New Deal. He didn't try to cut back on Social Security. He didn't try to cut back on farm price supports for farmers. He basically let the New Deal programs continue to run because he understood that he believed in his own way that they were necessary. Now, the 50s were a prosperous decade, and there wasn't a lot of pressure right then in the 50s for more social and economic reform of the kind that we got in the New Deal. There are two developments that did happen in the 50s that I want to flag. In many ways, the most important legislation passed under Dwight Eisenhower was the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. This is perhaps the largest public works construction project in the history of the country when you think about it. Congress authorized a 42,000-mile network of interstate highways to be financed by the federal government and by gasoline taxes. They justified it as necessary for civil defense. I don't know, Canada gets ready to invade us and we need to run troops up to northern New York, so we got to have the New York Thruway to get them there? I don't know. They presented it as national defense. Whatever it was certainly a windfall for the construction industry in this country, for the people who build gas stations, for the people who build hotels, and the fast food industry. All those people on the highways need a place to stay and a place to eat and a place to get gas. But, that was a huge project for spending government money to improve, from one level, improve society, put people to work, and make life better for people. So it is kind of a New Deal public works project under another name. Another important development in the late 50s is all because of that little ball up there, Sputnik. Sputnik. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. It was a 184-pound beach ball. It went flying around the Earth at 18,000 miles an hour, and it beeped. That's pretty much all it did. It beeped. But Americans were shocked. Absolutely shocked, because the Russians had figured out how to launch something into space before we did. And there was panic. Congress created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration to try to coordinate our development of rockets and our development of space exploration. And Congress committed, through the National Defense Education Act, that the federal government was going to start spending billions a year on science education. I mean, in other words, you couldn't just leave it up to the free market to make sure that America kept up with the Soviet Union. The federal government had to pump lots of money into science and research and universities. By 1960, the federal government was providing 20% of all university operating expenses and 70% of university research costs in the sciences. So a big change in what you want the federal government to do. Then that brings us to 1960. And in the election of 1960, the Republicans picked Vice President Richard Nixon. The Democrats picked Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy from a very politically connected family. His father was a big contributor to the Democratic Party. Joe Kennedy had served on the Securities and Exchange Commission for Franklin Roosevelt. He'd been ambassador to London. John Kennedy's grandfather on the other side had been a congressman and the mayor of Boston. Kennedy was a Harvard graduate, served in the Pacific during World War II, and was injured when his PT boat was sunk. He suffered from ongoing medical problems that his advisors kept secret in a way that probably would not be possible today. He had a serious back injury after the war. He was getting constant doses of heavy-duty painkillers. He also had an adrenaline deficiency, and he was getting daily shots of cortisone. Today, the media would be all over that. At the time, it was largely kept quiet. Kennedy was elected to the House in 1946, the same year that Richard Nixon got to Congress, and then he became a senator in 1952. There was no liberal media in 1960. 85% of major newspapers endorsed Richard Nixon. Kennedy was a newcomer. He'd been in the Senate for a little while, but he wasn't a particularly distinguished senator. He wasn't known for any really important legislation. And Nixon had been vice president for 8 years. Nixon did have a couple of problems. One of them was that Eisenhower didn't like him at all. And Eisenhower made very, very little effort to campaign on Nixon's behalf. And in fact, this is a killer. Toward Election Day, a reporter asked President Eisenhower to identify something that Nixon, as vice president, had really contributed to the Eisenhower administration. And Eisenhower said, "If you give me a few days, I might think of something." Ouch, right? Ouch. Nixon couldn't believe it. Kennedy's theme was that the United States was falling behind the Soviet Union and needed to modernize its economy, its educational system, its transportation, its military. One of the problems that Kennedy faced, of course, was his religion. Many Protestants in the country were very opposed to the notion of a Catholic president. Many Protestants believed that a Catholic would take orders from the Pope first before doing anything else. Kennedy tried to neutralize the issue. He went down to Houston and addressed the Southern Baptist Convention. And he told them, quote, "I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president who happens also to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me." The Southern Baptists expressed some, they were satisfied that he came down and talked to them, but a lot of them weren't convinced. One big development in 1960 was the first time we had televised debates. And there's the famous photo of the two of them. There were 4 debates, but the one that really sticks in it with everyone was the first one. Kennedy had been campaigning on the West Coast. He comes back. He's tan. He's healthy. He looks great. Nixon has been recovering from a bad head cold. He refused any makeup, and he looked sick. And the longer the first debate went on, the sicker he looked. And, it's interesting. Now, these guys, I once knew someone who actually had LPs. You remember LPs? A delivery system for music? Well, she had the LPs of the Kennedy-Nixon debates. And they were very interesting to listen to. Those guys were smart. They were polite. They talked intelligently to each other. It was a real, those were good debates. It's interesting. The people who listened on the radio by a small margin thought Nixon won. People who watched on television by a small margin thought Kennedy won. Appearances did matter. It was a very, very close election. Kennedy won the popular vote by only 100,000 votes. Having picked Lyndon Johnson of Texas as his vice presidential candidate certainly made a difference. It helped him capture several of the states in the South. There is a legend, it's unclear whether it's true, but the legend is that Mayor Richard Daley of Chicago, knowing that it was going to be close, sat on the returns from Cook County until he figured out how many votes he needed in order to offset the Republican votes from the southern half of Illinois. And when he finally figured out how many he needed, he reported how many votes there were in Chicago. I can neither confirm nor deny that that's true, but it's a great story. In any event, there were suspicions about fraud, but Nixon chose not to make an issue out of it. One of the first things that Kennedy did as president was to issue an executive order to create the Peace Corps. And it was a brilliant public relations move. It highlighted American idealism and our desire to try to help the less developed parts of the world. Within a couple of years, there were more than 7,000 volunteers visiting 44 countries. But apart from something like the Peace Corps, Kennedy had trouble getting anything through Congress. He wanted to do a number of the same things that Harry Truman had wanted to do: raise the minimum wage, provide federal help for education and housing, federal help for poor areas like Appalachia, national health insurance. The Southern Democrats who controlled Congress were having none of it. The only thing that Kennedy really was able to get through was funding for the space program. He did pledge that America would put a man on the moon by 1970. Congress did fund that. I don't know if you all remember, but I was in school in the early 60s, and everything would stop, and they'd roll out a TV, and we'd all go to the assembly room and watch the latest launch. Right? I mean, like, the public was fascinated watching the space program. In November 1963, Kennedy decides he has to travel to Texas. There is a split among the Democratic leadership in Texas. He thinks he needs to travel to Texas to try to smooth things out. There were so many anti-government fringe groups in Texas that Kennedy remarked to Jackie that day, this is a direct quote, "We are heading into nut country today, Jackie. But if somebody wants to shoot me from a window with a rifle, nobody can stop it, so why worry about it?" And of course, that's what happened. Police arrested Lee Harvey Oswald for shooting Kennedy and a police officer. Oswald was a former Marine who had defected to Russia and somehow returned. And then 2 days later, Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby shot Oswald in the basement of a Dallas police station, live on television. if you all remember that. Ooh, that's an interesting sound. America has been pretty good at, there was already a history of conspiracy theories in this country, but the Kennedy assassination opened a whole new chapter in people trying to figure out what happened and developing conspiracies to explain it. I have no opinion on what the actual answer is. But what I do know is that Lyndon Johnson became president. There is the famous photo of him taking the oath of office in the plane on the way back to Washington. Now, as I mentioned last week, Johnson's political idol was Franklin Roosevelt. Johnson had a very strong social conscience, and he was determined to complete Franklin Roosevelt's program for American liberalism. Johnson had a serious advantage in trying to do what he wanted to, because the 1960s was a really good time for the American economy. For a couple of decades there after World War II, the American economy could pretty much do no wrong. It was in the 50s, the economy grew 3.5% a year. And then in the 60s, the economy grew an average of nearly 6% every single year. Unprecedented level of sustained growth. Per capita income went up 40% in just that decade, the 1960s. Unemployment fell in half over the course of the 60s. The prosperity gave Johnson the confidence he could do what he wanted. And he told an aide, "I'm sick of all the people who talk about the things we can't do. Hell, we're the richest country in the world, the most powerful. We can do it all." His plans to do it all began with his State of the Union address in the beginning, January of 1964. So here's a quote from it.
"And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America. And I urge this Congress and all Americans to join with me in that effort. It will not be a short or easy struggle. No single weapon or strategy will suffice. But we shall not rest until that war is won. The richest nation on earth can afford to win it. We cannot afford to lose it."
So there we are, the richest nation on earth. We can do this. He took it a step further in addressing the commencement at University of Michigan in May of 1964. And this is where he unveiled his expression, the Great Society. So here's a quote from this commencement address at Michigan.
"For in your time, we have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the Great Society. The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we're totally committed in our time. But that is just the beginning."
So that is just the beginning. And he went on, and I'm going to I didn't want to run the whole speech, but here's some more of what he said about what the Great Society was going to mean. "The Great Society is a place where every child can find knowledge to enrich his mind and enlarge his talents. It is a place where the city of man serves not only the needs of the body and the demands of commerce, but the desire for beauty and the hunger for community. It is a place where man can renew his contact with nature. Our society will never be great until our cities are great. It will be the task of your generation to make the American city a place where future generations will come not only to live, but to live the good life. We have always prided ourselves on being not only America the strong and America the free, but America the beautiful. But today, that beauty is in danger. The water we drink, the food we eat, the very air that we breathe are threatened with pollution. I do not pretend that we have the full answer to those problems, but I do promise this. We are going to assemble the best thought and the broadest knowledge from all over the world to find those answers for America. This is really a sky's the limit view of what the federal government can do. Looking back on it, Joe Califano was one of his advisors on domestic affairs. And Califano, looking back on the Great Society, said that we simply could not accept poverty, ignorance, and hunger as intractable, permanent features of American society. There was no child we could not feed, no adult we could not put to work, no disease we could not cure, no toy, food, or appliance we could not make safer, no air or water we could not clean. You got to admire the ambition. You really do. It was, as I said, a sky's the limit approach to what the government can do. Now, in 1964, we're having a presidential election. The Republicans nominate Barry Goldwater, who is the polar opposite of Lyndon Johnson. Goldwater opposed virtually everything that the federal government had been doing since the 1930s, if not before. He wanted to repeal the income tax. He wanted to get rid of Social Security. He opposed integration. He opposed forced integration. He didn't want the government to have anything to do with integration. And he called for a total victory over communism. We would rather follow the world into kingdom come than consign it to hell under communism. So the Republican slogan was, in your heart, you know he's right. Democrats like to say, in your guts, you know he's nuts. And playing on fears that Goldwater might actually start a nuclear war, the Democrats came up with perhaps the single most famous political advertisement in American history. It only ran once. Come on now, you can do it.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9, 9.
0. These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
Okay, did that one scare you? Republicans howled bloody murder that was a cheap shot. And it was, let's face it. They only played it once, but the network TV news just kept playing it over and over again because it was a big story. In any event, not just because of that ad, but because Goldwater was not speaking to the mood of most Americans at the time. The 1964 election was the biggest landslide we've ever had. Lyndon Johnson got 61% of the popular vote. Nobody, not even Franklin Roosevelt in his best year or Ronald Reagan, reached 61%. One thing that did happen, you'll notice, is now the Deep South is voting Republican. Just as Johnson predicted when he signed the Civil Rights Act, the white South abandoned the Democratic Party and was now going to vote Republican. But the Democrat, this is a landslide, and the Democrats had 2/3 of both the House and the Senate. So Johnson and the Democrats are in the position to pass pretty much anything they want. And so Johnson's Great Society can come true. He can get what he wants out of Congress. So what did they do? Well, one thing is, as he declared war on poverty. So Congress passed well, let me back up for a second. Suppose you were in charge. How do you get rid of poverty in this country? What do you do? I mean, one thing you can do is just hand out lots of money, but government generally and voters are a little skeptical of just simply handing out money. You can provide jobs for people. And that was, as I've mentioned, public works projects were an important part of the New Deal. And the jobs that World War II created are really what ended the Great Depression. But Johnson had a different approach. His way of fighting poverty was to focus on opportunity, to give people more opportunities for better jobs through education and job training. He didn't try to create new jobs. He didn't try to redistribute the wealth by taxing, the most prosperous and handing the money down to the poor. The focus was on opportunity and education. And so the Economic Opportunity Act created a number of programs designed to help inner city children get better education, help low-income teenagers get to college, help people get educational and vocational training. But Congress did also increase how much was spent for things like Social Security and welfare. Welfare payments tripled during the 1960s. Congress also made the food stamp program permanent. By 1975, 11% of the families in this country were getting food stamps. Now, in his Great Society speech, Johnson promised to assemble the best thought and broadest knowledge from all over the world. And he tried. He created dozens of task forces on social problems. This would have been a great day to be a PhD in sociology or economics. I mean, there were so many committees and task forces in Washington looking at one social problem after another. By one count, Congress created 500 new federal programs just between 1965 and 1968. Johnson somehow hoped that it would all be painless because the economy would keep growing, tax receipts would go up because the economy was doing well, and it wouldn't really cost people anything to have all these programs. He wasn't planning to sock everyone with lots of higher taxes. One of the main achievements of the Great Society was Medicare and Medicaid, adopted as amendments to the Social Security Act in 1965. It's the most important change to the welfare state since the New Deal. We all know something about Medicare in this room, I suspect. The first person to get a Medicare card was former President Harry Truman. Truman had tried, as I've mentioned, Truman had really campaigned for national health insurance and never got anywhere with Congress. And a very elderly Harry Truman got the first Medicare card. The Medicaid program also provided funds to the states to help encourage them to cover the medical costs of people on welfare and other disadvantaged people like single-parent families and the blind and disabled. One of the things that Medicare did was it allowed doctors to charge reasonable fees at prevailing rates, which basically meant that healthcare costs were going to start going up and up and up because the government was going to reimburse them. Healthcare costs went up 14% in the first year after Medicare and Medicaid were passed. And then the spending really took off in the 70s. Another major component of the Great Society was federal money for education. First, elementary school education. The government started providing funds for schools in poor neighborhoods, books, federally funded textbooks for public and private schools, funding for gyms, music, language facilities. Johnson signed that bill with his childhood school teacher. There she is in the photo. Johnson went to, she was his teacher when he was a kid. And so he went down to Texas and signed the bill next to her. And then Congress, a few months later, passed a whole lot of federal aid for colleges, scholarships and loans for low-income students, funds to help college libraries. By 1970, 25% of college students were getting some form of federal aid. Totally different from what had been before. Education spending went tripled during the decade, and there was some progress. The number of people graduating from high school went up 20%. The number of people graduating from college went up 50%. To help the cities, Congress created a new cabinet department, Housing and Urban Development, and set aside billions of dollars to build public housing and to subsidize low-cost mortgages. The Model Cities Act provided funding for clearing out slums and redevelopment. The Fair Housing Act, designed to prevent discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. Federal spending on housing went up 400% during the decade. One of the biggest problems, and that really affected people where they lived, was just how bad the environment was in the late 60s. I don't know how much you can remember this, but so those are photos. That is Los Angeles and New York on the top. Real photos of smog in the mid-60s. I remember seeing a picture of downtown Pittsburgh in the mid-60s where you could barely see any buildings because the air was so bad. You had industrial waste just being poured into rivers and lakes. And that fire in the lower right there, that is the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland. You did not know, perhaps, that a river could catch fire. But it did, because there was so much stuff floating on the surface in Cleveland. So Congress started turning out a whole lot of environmental laws. Emission standards for automobiles, water quality standards for interstate waters, billions of dollars for water cleanup and sewage treatment, standards for regional air quality, and the consumer movement. Congress started looking at how to protect consumers. How did Ralph Nader get famous? It's that book, Unsafe at Any Speed, about the dangerous designs built into American automobiles. Inspired by that book, Congress passed the National Traffic Safety Act with safety standards to take effect on all new cars. Congress required accurate labeling. Think of all the things you can learn about your foods and other products from the labels. Those labels didn't used to be there. That was an innovation. Also, truth in lending. It was amazing how banks and mortgage companies kind of hid the ball about how much things were really going to cost. And Congress tried to do something about that. And then, you might say culture. Congress created the National Foundation for the Arts and Humanities to fund special arts projects. And then the Public Broadcasting Act, which created PBS and National Public Radio. Sesame Street first appeared in 1968. Masterpiece Theater. Yay. Masterpiece Theater first appeared in 1971. Okay, now, as we'll talk about in a few weeks, of course, in 1968, Johnson doesn't run again and Richard Nixon becomes president. In an obvious sense, the Great Society ended when Johnson retired and went home in 1969. But the Democrats maintained some pretty big majorities in Congress. And Nixon was smart, and Nixon realized that environmental legislation is really popular with the middle-class voters. And so when the Democrats in Congress continued to pass environmental laws, Nixon didn't get in the way. In fact, he encouraged them some of the time. So you have I'm just going to kind of run through them without going into tons of detail, but Congress started requiring federal agencies to develop, impact statements. How is every federal project, how is it going to affect the environment? Congress created emission standards for factories. Nixon himself created the EPA through an executive order to try to administer some of these laws. in 1970, 14,000 American workers died every year in workplace accidents. Congress passed the Occupational Safety and Health Act and created a new agency to try to improve workplace safety and make it less likely that people would get killed on the job. And the environmental legislation continued. Oh, it would work better if I could push the slide. There we are. Through the rest of the 70s with projects to try to clean up waters, regulate what happens to hazardous waste, and eventually the program for cleaning up what became known as Superfund sites. So the environmental movement, really, most of the key laws that we think of come along in the 70s, and while under first Nixon and then Gerald Ford and then Jimmy Carter. Okay, so what have we learned from all this? Most of the New Deal and Great Society programs that I've talked about are still around. They've become a heck of a lot more expensive, though. I was amazed when I figured this out. The government now spends 50% more on Social Security than it does on national defense. Medicare, just spending on Medicare alone, we're now spending about as much as we do on national defense. Welfare, we've cut back a little bit. It hasn't grown quite as much, but the social spending on programs created in the New Deal and the Great Society is now a huge part of the federal budget and something that's become very, very hard to tamper with. The environmental protection laws that I mentioned, most of them are still in place, although courts and the current administration are doing their best to weaken them. PBS and NPR are still on the air, although the current administration isn't paying for them any longer. So many of the laws and many of the agencies that come out of the Great Society are still with us. But it's worth mentioning, despite Johnson's great hopes, we didn't win the war on poverty. Thanks to the boom in the 1960s, poverty dropped quite a lot during the 60s. The number of people living below the federal poverty line went from 22% in 1960 to 13%, less than that, in 1970. But since 1970, it's been 50 years, and we really haven't done any better. It's still the case that 12, 13, 14% of Americans are living below the poverty line. So what happened? Well, the liberal mood that inspired the New Deal and the Great Society died, it seems to me, died in the 1970s. The person who best capitalized on that, of course, was Ronald Reagan. Where did that mood go? What happened? Well, one thing that happened is that the boom of the 1960s ended. If you remember the 70s were not that great a decade for the economy. We had oil crises. We had, the Arab oil embargo. We had high energy prices. We had recessions. We had very high inflation. The economy was struggling in the 70s. And, Johnson's idea that you could, all these programs would somehow work magically because you wouldn't have to raise taxes. As the economy went south, that became harder and harder to pull off, and more people in the middle class and the working class got tired of paying the taxes for so many of the programs that I've talked about. There was also gradually in the 70s a backlash against government regulation. And when you think about it, the environmental laws and the workplace safety laws that I've mentioned had much more of a direct impact on small businesses in this country than most of the other reforms that I've talked about. It's one thing, there were a lot of people who thought, the Great Society programs were okay, but when you start having people coming and telling you how to run your own workplace on environmental matters and how to treat your employees, a lot of people started to discover that they were being burdened by too much government. In his first inaugural speech, Ronald Reagan announced, "In the present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem." And that is when you think about it, in the space, in the space of 15 years, you go from the heady optimism of Lyndon Johnson that we can do anything because we're the richest country in the world. And if we put our minds to it and use the best and the brightest talent in America, we can figure out how to solve one social problem after another. And then you get to 1980, where the whole idea of the government trying to fix anything is the problem. That's what a total change. So the last presidential candidate to run as a true liberal was Walter Mondale in 1984. And you all remember what happened to Walter Mondale, right? He barely won his home state of Minnesota. It would be, the 70s turned into the 80s, and here we are 40 years later. The notion that government can solve problems is very much out of fashion. And I mean, I personally, like I said on Tuesday, I'm a dinosaur. I still believe that Franklin Roosevelt was right. To me, the test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. I would, personally kind of like to think that form of liberalism will make a comeback at some point. But I am not at all sure that I'm going to live long enough to see it happen. And I don't know, maybe it doesn't need to, maybe it had its day and doesn't need to come back. Maybe the future is going to be something entirely different. I don't know. But that's as far as I wanted to get for today. I hope this was helpful. Enjoy your Thanksgivings, and I will see you in 2 weeks where we'll have another cheerful talk about the Vietnam War. We'll see if I can find anything funny to say.